The relation of pure insight to the naive consciousness of absolute being now has a twofold aspect. On the one hand, pure insight is itself the same as that consciousness. On the other hand, this naive consciousness gives complete liberty to absolute being as well as to its parts in the simple element of its thought, and allows them to subsist there and to be valid only as its implicit being, and hence to be objectively valid. But in this implicit being, it renounces its own being for self. Insofar as, according to the first aspect, this faith is for pure insight in itself, pure self-consciousness, and has only to become this explicitly for itself, pure insight has in this notion of self-consciousness the element in which, instead of false insight, it realizes itself. Paragraph 544 is a very short one, and Hegel's just noting a few points for us in this. He talks about a twofold aspect of the relationship between two things that were talked about in the previous paragraphs. One is this naive consciousness, which is, you could say, in the narrative that's being talked about, where pure insight, or you might, if we want to personify it, the person of the Enlightenment is really the hero, then the naive consciousness is, in a certain respect, the one who's being rescued by the hero and being rescued from the villains that we saw Hegel talking about: superstition, priestcraft, and despotism. Now, how is pure insight going to relate itself as a mode of pure consciousness, something going beyond culture, to this naive consciousness? That's something that is really key to the whole movement, and you might say, if we want to use the term, the culture, the new culture that's being produced, of the Enlightenment. So Hegel tells us that the relation of pure insight, the connection, the way in which they're connected with each other, to the naive consciousness of absolute being, or absolute essence, if you like, Wesen, absolute Wesen, now has a twofold aspect. So on the one side, he says, pure insight is itself the same as that naive consciousness. We'll come back to that. That's an important point. Pure insight is not something that, according to the Enlightenment, is only available to a tiny little elite who studied and prepared themselves for years and years and years. It should be something that is, in theory, available to all. So pure insight ought to be available to whoever has just a regular consciousness. Now he says, on the other hand, this naive consciousness does something. So this is a way in which it's different from pure insight, which would never go along with this sort of nonsense. So what does it do? It says, this naive consciousness gives complete liberty to absolute being. Well, that sounds pretty good. As well as to its parts, in the simplest element of its thought, and allows them to subsist there and to be valid only as its implicit being, its being in itself, and hence to be objectively valid. But in the process, he says, it gives up its being for self. It's not self-conscious. It's not related to itself through consciousness. Instead, it's being captivated, you might say, by the content of absolute being. So we have a transition here to, having this sort of objective stuff that it's fascinated with, and which things it's fascinated with is really kind of contingent, isn't it? It just depends on what it happens to run across, which parts of absolute being. And so he says, okay, it renounces its own being for self, and then insofar, according to the first aspect, what's the first aspect? This identity. This faith. Now, notice what Hegel uses this term faith, right? Faith and pure insight are connected with each other. This faith is for pure insight in itself, pure self-consciousness, and has only to become this explicitly for itself. So insofar as this faith has to become explicitly for itself, pure insight, he says, has in this notion of self-consciousness, this idea that has yet to be developed and will be developed through the Enlightenment, has in this notion the element in which, instead of false insight, why do we talk about false insight here? Well, that was what the priests were preaching, right? That was what superstition relied upon. It realizes itself, he says. So it's going to be making itself actual. So Hegel is not giving us some sort of major transformation here. He's just leading us into the next section in which we're going to get a really interesting metaphor. Since from this aspect both are essentially the same and the relation of pure insight takes place through and in the same element, the communication between them is direct and their giving and receiving is an unimpeded flow of each into the other. Whatever wedges of any sort may be driven into consciousness, it is in itself this simplicity in which everything is dissolved, forgotten, and unbiased, and which therefore is absolutely receptive to the notion. It is on this account that the communication of pure insight is comparable to a silent expansion or to the diffusion, say, of a perfume in the unresisting atmosphere. It is a penetrating infection which does not make itself noticeable beforehand as something opposed to the indifferent element into which it insinuates itself and therefore cannot be warded off. Only when the infection has become widespread is that consciousness, which unheedingly yielded to its influence, aware of it. For though the nature of what consciousness received into itself was simple and homogeneous with it, yet it was also the simplicity of an intro-reflected negativity, which subsequently also develops, in keeping with its nature, into something opposed to it, and thereby reminds consciousness of its previous state. This simplicity is the notion, which is the simple knowing that knows itself and also its opposite, but knows this opposite to be reduced to a moment within it. Consequently, when consciousness does become aware of pure insight, the latter is already widespread. The struggle against it betrays the fact that infection has occurred. The struggle is too late, and every remedy adopted only aggravates the disease, for it has laid hold of the marrow of spiritual life, that is, the notion of consciousness, or the pure essence itself of consciousness. Therefore, too, there is no power in consciousness which could overcome the disease. Because this is present in the essence itself, its manifestations, while still isolated, can be suppressed, and the superficial symptoms smothered. This is greatly to its advantage, for it does not now squander its power or show itself unworthy of its real nature, which is the case when it breaks out in symptoms and single eruptions antagonistic to the content of faith and to its connection with the reality of the world outside it. Rather, being now an invisible and imperceptible spirit, it infiltrates the noble parts through and through, and soon has taken complete possession of all the vitals and members of the unconscious idol. Then, one fine morning, it gives its comrade a shove with the elbow, and bang, crash, the idol lies on the floor. On one fine morning, whose noon is bloodless if the infection has penetrated to every organ of spiritual life. Memory alone then still preserves the dead form of the spirit's previous shape as a vanished history, vanished one knows not how. And the new serpent of wisdom, raised on high for adoration, has in this way painlessly cast merely a withered skin. Paragraph 545, if we wanted to be a little facetious, we could give it the title of Kant's famous book, or actually short little essay, What is Enlightenment? Because Hegel is telling us quite a bit about what is going on in the Enlightenment. He's giving us kind of, you might say, a bit of the inside scoop about it. We often have this picture to ourselves as people that are very distanced from it, that it's more like what Hegel was describing at the start. This, we've got these brave souls who are going against, the priesthood and despotism and the superstition of the people and writing treatises and getting in everybody's face. But actually, the Enlightenment worked in a somewhat different way. And that's what Hegel's going to talk about here in terms of pure insight. There's two master metaphors running throughout this long section. One of them is that, which we're going to talk about in a bit, of diffusion, something like, the diffusion of an odor or an essence throughout an area. But the other one, which is much more interesting, has to do with a sort of hollowing out, an emptying, or even, if you like, a rotting from within of the things that it appears that Enlightenment is attacking. Enlightenment can attack them precisely because they have lost the dynamism that they would have had. And why did they lose it? Well, it came about through the effort of pure insight itself. And so Hegel has this wonderful line that is taken from Denis Diderot's Rameau's nephew, one of his great works. I'm actually a very big fan of Diderot myself because he's a fun writer. And that is really a story about the culture of the time. And it almost appears in some respects nihilistic. But what he's discussing there is how, well, I'll just read it to you. He says, one fine morning, it gives its comrade a shove with the elbow and bang, crash. The idol lies on the floor. What's the idol? The idol is some sort of thing that we take for, having absolute value, giving meaning to our life, helping us orient ourselves. It might be the project. It might be a particular hierarchical relationship. It might be understanding our place in the order of things or in history. And any of these things can become hollowed out in that way. It's not that they don't have any meaning. It's just that they don't have as much meaning as they portray themselves to. They don't have meaning in a very practical sense. So let's take up from the start with this text what he's saying here. He says, from this aspect, both are essentially the same. What are the both? I think that we have to interpret the both here as pure insight and the naive consciousness that has been talked about for the last several paragraphs. Both are essentially the same. And he says the relation of pure insight takes place through and in the same element. The communication between them, the communication between the naive consciousness and pure insight is going to happen through that element. So, the naive consciousness doesn't really know itself, doesn't fully understand itself. But you could say it's primed to move on to something greater, to move on to a fuller knowledge. It has to become for itself, as Hegel says. Pure insight is almost entirely for itself, but it's not for itself yet in a concrete way, in part because it lacks content, and that's what the naive consciousness is going to provide it, and so is faith and culture. So Hegel goes on and he says the communication between them is direct. They're giving and receiving. There's a back and forth here. So it's not just pure insight telling the naive consciousness, hey, dummy, here's how the world is, or why don't you pay attention to this? It's also, this is what we call a dialectical process. There's a dialogue going on between the two of them, a communication. The naive consciousness has something to say to pure insight. And pure insight, if it's really pure insight, has to learn from what the naive consciousness has to say to it. I mean, you could say those are the people on the ground who can tell you about the conditions that people are living in. So he says this giving and receiving is an unimpeded flow of each into the other. Almost sounds as if they're going to modify each other in the process. Now he says, whatever wedges of any sort may be driven into consciousness, it is in itself this simplicity. So we can make distinctions, but there really is a simplicity here, he says. And it's the simplicity of the notion, of the concept, the Begriff. So he says, it's the simplicity in which everything is dissolved, forgotten, and unbiased, and which is therefore is absolutely receptive to the notion. So let's pause here. What are we talking about? how can we picture this to ourselves? Or better yet, how can we conceptualize it, wrap our heads around it? So this is happening at a certain, not point, but period of history in the West, where Hegel's not talking about these sorts of forces, but think about the role that literacy and the printing press plays in this, the capacity for being able to discuss things back and forth with each other, to hear perspectives that are not simply those of not just the elite, but a certain kind of elite, being able to take on the values that other people might bring up. So, I mean, if you have a peasant farmer who can go to market and go into a coffee shop, and after he kicks the mud off of his boots and plunks his money down, because he's actually read something, somebody might take him seriously when he says, all this fine talk that you have is really great, but it doesn't really put any turnips in my larder or help me figure out how to lessen the taxes that those nobles and churchmen are demanding from me and keeping me from actually filling my belly. I mean, this sounds very prosaic, but that's the sort of thing where pure insight might say, well, you've got a point there, right? Let's think about this. Let's hash this out. Let's talk about this. So I think what Hegel is talking about here partly is the development of what has later come to be called the public sphere, in which all these sort of ideas can circulate and people can talk with each other and, become conscious. So he says, it's on this account, now here's the nice metaphor, that the communication of pure insight is comparable to a silent expansion. You don't notice it going on. Pure insight, I mean, it can be very aggressive and assertive and make a lot of itself, but that's probably going to be more like a false insight, like Hegel's been talking about. Real pure insight just does its thing, and it spreads out throughout the entire room or throughout the entire world, the culture. He says it's comparable to a silent expansion or to the diffusion, say, of a perfume in the unresisting atmosphere. He says it's a penetrating infection which does not make itself noticeable beforehand as something opposed to the indifferent element in which it insinuates itself, and therefore cannot be warded off. There's no, gas detection equipment. I used to have a friend who specialized in selling gas detection equipment, and that stuff is really quite interesting. I mean, it could save your life too if you find out that carbon monoxide is accumulating in a place or some gas from an industrial process. That's very nice. There's nothing like that when it comes to pure insight. There's no canary in the coal mine that tells you that something's happening to the culture. Instead, things are diffusing into it. And pure insight is gradually seeping its way into all of the institutions, all of the discourses. It might take the form of irony when it can't accomplish much, or desperation. Sometimes it'll take on the form of critique or calls for reform, plans for how things can be made better. So he says, only when the infection has become widespread is that consciousness, which unheedingly yielded to its influence, aware of it. And what are we talking about there? Actually, I put culture down here, but I may as well have put, say, state power, or wealth, or the noble consciousness associated with service of state power. And we also have faith. Now, what is pure insight doing in the course of the early modern period leading us into the Enlightenment? It's gradually permeating all these spheres, that of culture. And sometimes just asking questions. Well, why? Why do we have a monarch? And then you could justify it, write a philosophical treatise. Absolute monarchy is absolutely needed. But that starts to raise questions, doesn't it? I mean, this is one reason why Hobbes who you would think would have been highly favored by the monarchists, actually wasn't. I mean, the king did have Hobbes at his court after things got sorted out, and there's a restoration, right? But they didn't enact Hobbes' political theory. It was really too radical. He's justifying more of that vision of the sovereign than the real sovereign could endure. And we can go on and on and on. You might say that pure insight is not always hostile to faith or culture. It's saying, let me make you what you ought to be. Faith. Don't you want to be connected with God? Well, then we have to think about, things morally and evaluate how people are actually behaving and, point out when things aren't going the way that they should. Or should we think about these texts and, where did these come from? How did they get handed down? Why do we have different copies that don't always agree with each other? It's asking these questions, opening up these realms for consciousness to go in. And so you can have people within the church, for example, who are the greatest critics within the church. Sometimes they get kicked out, right? But that's how it really develops. It's not simply outside forces saying, this is all nonsense, superstition, it's garbage, get rid of it. You don't begin with the new atheists in the middle of the Enlightenment. Instead, it's churchmen themselves asking questions, probing, saying, oh, wait a second, what about this? Similarly in culture, too. So he goes on and he says, okay, so the infection became widespread. That consciousness, which unheedingly yielded to its influence, becomes aware of it. So the other forms of consciousness, the other shapes, the Gestalten, are becoming, you might say, infected by pure insight. And he says, through the nature of what consciousness received, although the nature of what consciousness received into itself was simple and homogeneous with it, it was also the simplicity, as he says, of an intro-reflected negativity, which subsequently also develops, in keeping with its nature, into something opposed to it. So critique, or the critical negative aspect here, introduces to these things which seem to be, okay with themselves, self-identities, new opposition within them. They become divided against themselves. And this is a very important development. So he says, here we go. Reminds consciousness of its previous state. This simplicity is the notion, which is the simple knowing that knows itself and its opposite. So that the notion now is entering into these historical shapes of consciousness, entering into institutions, entering into long-standing traditions and discourses, and gutting them, hollowing them out, finding the places where things aren't entirely clear, trying to clarify them, and in the process, introducing some hollowness to them. So he says, the notion is a simple knowing that knows itself and its opposite, but knows this opposite to be reduced to a moment within it. So he says, when consciousness does become aware of pure insight, the latter is already widespread. By the time, this is why you can't really hold back cultural critique, other than just by killing everybody and engaging in real repression. But even that doesn't work for that long. Once pure insight is there, Hegel is saying, you don't really have the option of just squashing it. You have to grapple with it. You have to work your way through it. So he says, the struggle against it betrays the fact that the infection has occurred. Even among the ones who are posing themselves in the narrative that they're telling, where they're the ones who aren't infected by it. They're the naive consciousness in a different respect, the honest consciousness from before. They are infected by it. And we see this playing itself out over and over and over again, even in our contemporary culture, where you look at conservatives and you're like, you're not really that conservative. You don't even live up to your own ideals, or the stuff that you're saying. If you looked at what conservatives were saying 40 years ago, what you're saying is almost the opposite of it. Which I mean, the conservatives are in a certain sense the new radicals, the new counterculture. And you can look at liberals and progressives, and say you're not as progressive as you seem to be. In some respects, you're actually quite conservative. You just want things to stay the same, just kind of moving along in this direction. And we can delve into this in many other respects as well. But you see this happening over and over again. This kind of, lining up of who people are, the characters in a narrative. So he says, the struggle is too late. Every remedy adopted only aggravates the disease. You're not going to beat pure insight at its own game. You're not going to be smarter than it. You better ride it out and see where it goes. So he says, it's laid hold of the marrow of spiritual life. That is, the notion of consciousness, the pure essence itself of consciousness. And we might get less metaphysical than that and say, listen, what happens here is it does lay its hold on the marrow of consciousness, the particular shapes of consciousness, what makes them what they are, and says, you're not what you think you are. So he goes, there is no power in consciousness that could overcome the disease. Why? Because no matter what remedy you attempt, you're going to have to rely on pure insight and the notion to bring it in, to be effective. This has some very vast implications if we think about our own time. So he says that because this is present in the essence, its manifestations, while isolated, can be suppressed and the superficial symptoms smothered. But this plays into its hands. He says, this is greatly to its advantage. Now it doesn't squander its power, show itself unworthy of its real nature, which is the case when it breaks out when it actually takes concrete form in symptoms and single eruptions. I mean, you can try to repress the critical movement, the critical aspect of pure insight. You can do that, but then you make people idealistic. They don't know yet that the reformers and the enlightened people are just jerks like the rest of us. They think they're heroes. And they secretly want to be like them and will welcome them when there's an opportunity. You're better off actually letting this run its course and show itself to be just as full, as far as a movement goes, just as full of egoistic jerks and posers as any other movement is, right? If you try to repress it or just try to say it's just bad, for example, one of the things that's talked about a lot today is postmodernism, as if somehow Derrida and Foucault or Deleuze or people like that are even, often read by the majority of the public, or even read much in the university, which is not the case, as if somehow they contaminated the culture, and now, we've lost, the Enlightenment and modernity, and postmodernity is threatening us all with nihilism and stuff like that. And this is such a caricature that when you say stuff like that, you almost make people like me say maybe postmodernism isn't so bad if these people are, think it's so bad, and clearly they have no idea what the hell they're talking about. And many other people might be attracted to it similarly. You can't win except by engaging your enemy at their strongest points, and you've got to use the same weapons. But that means you've already lost at this point. Sort of like the dialectic that we saw with virtue in the way of the world. Hegel goes on and he says that being an imperceptible and invisible spirit, pure insight infiltrates the noble parts through and through. And soon has taken complete possession of the vitals and members of the unconscious idol. What are we talking about? Faith here. We're talking about something that Hegel had said is in itself. It does not have self-consciousness. It has consciousness of its particular content. Once pure insight comes into faith, seemingly to make faith stronger, it actually weakens it. So this is where we get the one fine morning. He says, on one fine morning whose noon is bloodless if the infection is penetrated into every organ of spiritual life. And then what we get is a kind of museum existence for the objects of faith. He says, memory alone preserves the dead form of the spirit's vanished shape, previous shape as a vanished history, vanished one knows not how. Now, this is perfectly compatible with having a continuance of, say, religious life going on, but it actually does become quite detached from how most religious people are understanding what's going on. So faith can become hollowed out from inside, as we see happen over and over and over again. This is why in the West we have all these interesting new religious movements, both within the Protestant spectrum, generally forming new denominations, often not meaning to, starting out as a reform movement, and saying we have to revitalize faith because it's become moribund, it's become dead. Within the Catholic and Orthodox spectrum, it happens within, and there are different movements or orders or things going on. Sometimes long-lasting, sometimes not so. But the point is here, he says, memory alone preserves the dead form of the spirit's previous shape, and the new serpent of wisdom, raised on high for adoration, has in this way painlessly cast a withered skin away from itself. The skin of an older understanding of religion, which was an understanding of the human comportment in relation to the divine. So the Enlightenment consists, to bring this all back to the main point, in this diffusion that goes into the institutions, goes into the traditions, goes into the shapes of consciousness, and in some respect colonizes them. Takes them over, rendering them unable to be what they previously were. But this silent, ceaseless weaving of the spirit in the simple inwardness of its substance, spirit concealing its action from itself, is only one side of the realization of pure insight. Its diffusion consists not merely in the fact that like goes together with like, nor is its actualization merely an expansion in which there is no antithesis. On the contrary, the action of the negative essence is no less essentially a developed, self-differentiating movement which, being a conscious act, must give its moments a definite manifest existence and must appear on the scene as a sheer uproar and a violent struggle with its antithesis. Paragraph 546 is now setting the scene for a struggle that's going to happen in the Enlightenment, but a struggle that's going to happen not only between pure insight and faith, or pure insight and culture in terms of politics, but between pure insight in one sense, you might say in its universal, and pure insight in its reality, as it's made concrete. So Hegel says that he talks about a silent, ceaseless weaving of the spirit and the simple inwardness of its substance, very poetic there. Spirit concealing its action from itself. What is he referring to? What's been going on previously in this discussion of diffusion into the culture and into faith? Spirit is, both sides and doesn't quite know what's going on until it comes to consciousness of what has taken place historically. But that's not all that's happening, Hegel's saying. Right? He says the diffusion of pure insight consists not merely in the fact that like goes along with like. What was like and like in that case? The pure insight and the naive consciousness. Nor is its actualization merely an expansion in which there's no antithesis. It was, expanding into other shapes of consciousness, colonizing them. But what happens in the process of doing so, in the process of becoming successful, It's going to generate its own opposition, its own antithesis. So he says, the action of the negative essence, which is the pure insight, is no less essentially a developed, self-differentiating moment, which must give its moments definite manifest existence, must appear on the scene as sheer uproar and a violent struggle with its antithesis. Now, how is that violent struggle going to take place? Well, we're going to see. So just to set the scene, what we're going to do is move through what it is that pure insight is generating. How does it become concrete? How does it have a shape of its own in the world? And then what does that look like? Does it really live up to its own ideals? Or does it become something that becomes its own enemy? This is looking far, far down the line to things like, radical freedom and the terror, absolute freedom and the terror. But we don't have to go quite that far yet. Just think about institutions where we have people engaged in critique and how critical they so often become of those who actually do take a stand on that basis.